All right, this is the Great Flood of 2020, a realistic scenario that we're going to use for you to demonstrate your skills and understanding in microbiology to answer some real-world questions. In video 3, we introduced the idea of water analysis testing. Now, water analysis testing can be very, very expensive, and many times we're testing many samples. So to start off with, we always initiate presumptive testing. If we have 1,000 water samples from 1,000 different locations and we're looking for the presence of fecal coliform bacteria, it can get very expensive. Presumptive testing narrows down those samples to only those samples that have a high probability of containing fecal contamination. This is what we're going to start off with this week. And then from there, after we narrow down samples, we can move on to the more rigorous confirmation tests, which provides more evidence of fecal contamination. And only those samples that are positive will we run into completed tests, which give us a lot of information, such as what is the density of bacteria, how much is present, exactly what is it. This week, we're going to start off with some presumptive testing that follows along from a story that we'll introduce right now. So I'll make a disclaimer before I start telling our story. This is not a true story. It hasn't actually happened, but it's a plausible story in that it's one that could possibly happen in the future. So let's look at our campus right now. So this is just a close-up of the ISC and Newton, and because we're going to be studying fecal contamination of the water supply in the area, I should note that Newton Hall right here with the ISC attached does look a little bit like a toilet from above. Over here on the right-hand side, we've got Main Street. So this should all be fairly familiar to you. These little dots are all people walking around campus. Let's zoom out a little bit. Now, if we zoom out, we can still see that we've got Newton and the ISC right here. We can also highlight the Geneseo campus that includes all of the residence halls, athletic fields, and all of the academic buildings. Over on the right-hand side, we see the neighborhoods of Geneseo, and if we were to follow this road up here, we'd eventually make it to the retail area with Wegmans and the bowling alley and McDonald's. You've all spent time at Geneseo, so you all recognize that there's some pretty big hills in the area. If you're walking from the town down the hill to the valley down below, there's a pretty big hill, which means that there could be plenty of runoff. So this is what happened during April of 2020. There was a big, huge rainstorm that lasted for about a week, dumping tons of rain on the town of Geneseo, which led to a lot of runoff. So the rain that collected in the town started running down the hills. It ran through the sewer systems as it was collected municipally, and it ended up down here in the valley. So let's zoom out one more time. Now, again, I can highlight the campus of SUNY Geneseo. And to the east, we have the town of Geneseo and the retail area that is all uphill. And to the left or to the west, we can see the Genesee River Valley that is clearly downhill. If you were looking from the gazebo towards the northwest, you might just be able to see the town of Piffard. And Piffard is where we are going to start our story. So in April 2020, great big rainstorms dumped a ton of water on the town of Geneseo. It all flooded through the sewer systems and it flooded the wastewater treatment plant, and it ended up running towards the Genesee River Valley. So in the valley, again, if you were looking from the student center downhill, you can see the Genesee River flows from the south to the north through Geneseo, eventually reaching Rochester. But because of all of the rains and all of the runoff, this valley down at the bottom overflowed its banks and ended up flooding. Because of all this flooding, the residents of Piffard, who, in our story, rely entirely on their water from their own wells, started to get sick. The well water became contaminated with all of the flood water from the Genesee Valley, and people started coming down with cases of gastroenteritis or digestive issues that often led to vomiting and diarrhea, and it led to hospitalizations. But the doctors at the hospitals didn't know what agent was causing the gastroenteritis because it's a fairly generalized condition that could be caused by bacteria or viruses, and they didn't have a clear idea of exactly what was causing it. So the EPA came in and they started looking at sources of potential fecal contamination because gastroenteritis is often caused by contaminants from the sewer system or from fecal contamination. And they found that the National Warplane Museum was a potential source of fecal contamination. The Warplane Museum is a site for an annual air show, and there's frequently banks of porta potties near the Genesee River that build up so that people can use the bathroom during the air show. And it's likely that during the flood, some of these porta potties overflowed and released their contents into the Genesee River. Another potential source of contamination is just simply runoff from the sewer system and from storm drains. So water that had collected in the town and started running downhill entered the Genesee River down at the bottom of the hill near the bridge, just a little bit west of the Statesman. Anything that happened to be in the roads up in town would have been washed down the street and simply dumped into the river and would have contributed to the floodwaters. Anything that could have been in that water may have been the cause of the gastroenteritis for the citizens in Pafard. If we move a little north, the town of Geneseo has a wastewater treatment plant, and we can see that the floodwaters overflowed the wastewater treatment plant, emptying the biological treatment ponds and releasing incompletely treated human waste into the floodwaters along the Genesee River. Further north of the wastewater treatment plant are a number of agricultural fields that are easily seen from campus. These fields are heavily fertilized for crop growth, and they're also used for grazing animals. Shortly after the Genesee Valley flooded, the waters receded when the rains stopped and the flooding disappeared, leaving us with just the Genesee River. However, the question was still present: where did the fecal contamination come from? Because if there was fecal contamination in the first place, then it's likely that it would be problematic in the future if the river ever flooded again. So that's going to be the main part of your question. Now that the water is receded, it's necessary for us to establish what the source of fecal contamination was that caused the residents of Pafard to fall ill. Did it come from overflowing porta potties at the Airplane Museum? Did it come from runoff from the streets of Geneseo? Did it come from overflowing biological treatment ponds at the wastewater treatment plant? Or was the source the fertilizer in the agricultural fields or waste from animals that were grazing in nearby fields? So this will be our job for the upcoming weeks until the end of the semester. I'm going to have you read about and become familiar with water testing procedures. There will be some links and resources provided both on Canvas and in your lab handout. We're going to have you interpret the results of water testing from the 4 possible sources of fecal contamination that we just described. You're going to establish which location, based on your data, was the source of contamination, and then in a PowerPoint presentation, provide evidence to support this decision.